The day after the surrender of Italy in World War II and the death of Mussolini, the long-awaited Western Front was opened in the Second World War. This event, of course, is known as Operation Overlord, and it took place on June 6, 1944, a day better known in history as D-Day. This invasion had been planned for over 2 years, and for over 2 years, American and British soldiers had been amassing all up and down the British coast, as you can see on this map. The D-Day invasion was an amphibious invasion, and it launched from several points. And this was an everything plus the kitchen sink invasion, where Gallipoli had failed for just not simply being large enough. There was no chance of this happening. This was an invasion that had been planned for more than 2 years, and again, soldiers and equipment had been amassed for it for approximately that long as well. The Germans weren't stupid, and they knew it was coming, and they did their best to be ready for it. And the Allies did their best to throw the Germans off. You can see on this map where the invasion landed, of course, here in the northern French province of Normandy, the beaches of Normandy. Decoy ships and planes and false intelligence had convinced the Germans pretty successfully that the invasion would happen up this way, further to the north, more directly north of the city of Paris. And as you can see there with the Nazi sign, the Germans were awaiting the Allied invasion at that place. And so when the Allies landed further to the west, they did encounter heavy German resistance, but the greatest part of the German defenses were a little bit further to their east and to the north. And so the Allies were able to invade and able to encounter that defense, that resistance, a little bit more successfully. I will show you some pictures in a moment of the landing at D-Day. It's pretty awesome. It's a pretty incredible thing to see. There's a great legend, and I don't know if there's any way this could be true, but it's a great story, a great legend. If you've ever been to Normandy, France, you know that there are cliffs. So the cliffs of Normandy that overlook the English Channel. And so the D-Day invasion launched very early in the morning, and so they would have been coming ashore close to dawn. And the legend goes that the Nazi guards who were walking patrol on the cliffs that morning looked out over the horizon and simply saw the water. And then when they turned back again, coming up over the horizon from one side of the ocean to the other, in the entire line of sight, warships filling up the entire horizon, the invasion was coming. And the one officer turned to the other and said, "The Third Reich is no more." And while this is probably just a legend, it's a good one, and it's a very instructive. A lot of people misunderstand D-Day for the end of the war. And D-Day was not the end of the war. The war went on until May 1945, so 11 more months to go. But D-Day is it's absolutely appropriate to think of D-Day as the beginning of the end of the war. Now, this invasion is considered one of the most successful in military history, but by no means was that guaranteed. The Allies weren't sure what they were going to encounter in terms of German defensive forces, and the invasion was actually delayed a couple of times because of bad weather and bad seas. The invasion was led by Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower, who was an American and who happens to be my famous relative, so very happy he's not my notorious relative, which he might be if this had gone badly. But even in the person of the high command here, there was no real sense of absolute assuredness that this was going to work. Eisenhower had drafted a letter of resignation for President Franklin Roosevelt in the event of the failure of the invasion, and he had written a letter of apology to the American and British people, which he planned to have published should the invasion fail. So he was ready for success, but also ready for failure. But fortunately, things went well. The soldiers traveled across the English Channel on large warships, from which they were deployed in landing crafts to actually go ashore at Normandy. And the first day of fighting, the Allied forces took many, many casualties. These photographs were taken by journalists who were embedded with the soldiers. And these poor guys who were the first ones off the ship, they took very heavy casualties going ahead. They were incredibly brave because, as you can see here, the cliffs of Normandy, you see the clouds from the bad weather. And these guys, they're dropped off in the ocean. Here, you have to go the last few hundred yards in the ocean, and the German defenses are up higher than you are, and they really were kind of like sitting ducks. But they went ahead, wave after wave of them, and took very, very, very heavy casualties the first day, with more men being shot and killed than actually making it ashore. But they just kept coming. This is one of the things that differentiated D-Day from Gallipoli. Like, they just kept coming, and eventually the beaches were all taken. And you can see here in these photographs, as men and machines and goods continued to come ashore, this is the largest invasion in military history, or at least it was up until that point, taking approximately 5 weeks to complete. But the area had been secured within the first 24 hours. Just another picture of the continuing invasion of the France at D-Day. 1 month later, Allied forces liberated the city of Paris to great fanfare. Now, this was really all for show, and the reason for that was because once the Allies had been successful at Normandy, the Germans went ahead and they went into retreat. They started to retreat back towards Germany to defend the homeland. So the Germans were gone from Paris. So this liberation of Paris a couple of months after D-Day was really largely for show. But thousands and thousands of Allied troops go marching in to the city of Paris. It was a great day of celebration. And this actually stymied a planned communist uprising in the city. So the big show and the big parade of the Allied soldiers through the city of Paris actually ended up putting off a planned communist uprising there, because, you know, the communists were like, well, darn, we can't stage a revolution here with the Allied soldiers. That would have been bad manners, so they didn't. Here are the great number of Allied soldiers coming in. They were greeted as heroes. Here are the Americans in Times Square coming out into the square to celebrate news of the liberation of the city of Paris. So even though they were pulling back towards Germany, the Germans were not done yet. Hitler kept coming, and in the fall of 1944 launched the final offensive of the war in a very drawn-out battle that came to be known as the Battle of the Bulge. Before, that was just associated with waistlines. This was an offensive that had a very long front line that went from Belgium down towards France, and it was called the Battle of the Bulge because the front line kept bulging back and forth. It would bulge to the west, and then it would bulge to the east, and so this was by no means a cakewalk for the Allies. The Germans put up a very heavy fight for several months across the winter of 1944 into 1945, but ultimately Even though the battle lines did occasionally bulge out towards the west, this was a battle in which the Germans were in retreat and the Allies were chasing them back into Germany. Here's some pictures of the trucks rolling across the frontiers, the Allied troops moving in. The Battle of the Bulge was mainly fought over the winter. It was a very costly battle in terms of casualties, and it was very difficult conditions. A lot of veterans of the Battle of the Bulge recall the conditions just really being tough, because not only was it very cold, as you can see here, but because they very often were fighting in thick wooded areas and they were fighting in snow and in fog, it was difficult to tell who you were shooting at and where your enemies were. Look at this guy, frozen bullets. How do you keep your bullets going into your machine gun unfrozen? So tough conditions and a battle that incurred heavy casualties on both sides, but one in which the Germans ultimately went into full retreat, so the Allies were victorious. In February of 1945, the Big Three met again at the resort town of Yalta. Yalta is a coastal town in Russia. And by 1945, Allied victory was assured. Remember, at Tehran, they had decided that they would fight until unconditional surrender. And so in 1945, even as early as February, there was really, the handwriting was on the wall. They didn't know when Germany would surrender, but they were really in full retreat and desperation mode. And so the Big Three got together to discuss what the post-war world was going to look like. Now that we know, we're pretty sure we're going to win, what are we going to do after we are victorious? And they made some very important decisions at Yalta. Stalin was still furious about how long it had taken the British and Americans to open up a Western front. The Russians had suffered badly over the course of the war, and they were still engaged in heavy fighting with the Germans, even though since 1943, the Germans had essentially been in a state of retreat out of Russia. Russia had incurred enormous casualties, both in military and in civilian lives lost. Like I mentioned last time, historians estimate that World War II claimed 55 million lives around the globe, people who died directly as a result of the war. And of those 55 million, approximately 20 million of them were Russians. And because of this hardship, Churchill and Roosevelt went kind of easy on Stalin, and because they needed his continued assistance, they needed him to stay in the war. And Roosevelt particularly was hoping to gain promises from the Russians and British that they would, after Germany had surrendered, assist the United States in their fight against Japan. So you have to remember, there was this whole other theater of war in World War II. And so Roosevelt dealt easily with Stalin. Churchill and Roosevelt at Yalta made Stalin some pretty big promises in terms of allowing him to occupy territory. The Red Army at this time was swooping through huge amounts of territory in Eastern Europe, places like Hungary and Poland and the Ukraine, etc. And so Stalin's saying, well, I'm going to occupy this territory. I need a buffer state from these mean Germans here for a while. And really kind of reluctantly, the American president and Churchill, they said okay. They didn't feel easy about it, but they said okay. They really didn't know what else they could say. And they elicited from Stalin in exchange what were really rather vague promises about promising not to stay forever in these territories and to hold free elections in them. Now, of course, you've got Churchill on the left, Roosevelt in the middle, and Stalin on the right in this photograph. Look at the American president, Franklin Roosevelt. Look how old and sick and tired he appears. This war, he had never really been of robust health, and this war had certainly taken a great toll on him. Roosevelt was dead less than 2 months after this picture was taken. He died in April of 1945 of an aneurysm. He did not live to see the end of the war. And this is important in and of itself, but it's incredibly important in that this set up a new American president to deal with Stalin as the war ended, because already by February of 1945, as Germany was becoming less of a significant ally, tensions were rising between the Russians and the Western allies. And so the Cold War was brewing. But in the meantime, there were the Nazis to defeat, and they were pushing in. I love this picture. Happy Easter, Adolf. Do you see what the signs the soldiers have for their bombs read? This was pretty much the situation. The Russians were pushing in from the east, the American and British forces from the south, and the American and British forces from the west. Germany was surrounded. There was no way out for them. Time magazine, May 7th, 1945. Adolf Hitler, who had been Time magazine's Man of the Year in 1938, was officially a persona non grata. Many historians believe that on this day, actually May 7th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin with his mistress, who he had married the day before, Eva Braun. So he was not around to surrender when Germany surrendered to the Allies unconditionally on May 8th, 1945. His top underlings were left to do that. And the war in Europe was over. May 8th, VE Day. Now, one of the promises that had been made at Yalta, and this is something that really made Roosevelt and Churchill's stomachs turn a little bit, was that the Russian army was going to be the army to go into and occupy the capital city of Germany, the city of Berlin. And this was going to happen for a couple of reasons. And the first was simply geographic. The city of Berlin is well into the eastern part of Germany, and so the Russians were simply going to get there first. But, however, Stalin wanted to go into Berlin first. He felt he was owed this. He felt he had borne the brunt of the war, and there was a lot of truth to that. And so the Americans and British agreed to hold back and to allow the Soviets to enter and occupy Berlin first, which they did. And this was a brutal and gruesome time in Berlin, as you might imagine. This was a time for revenge. This was a time for vengeance in which the Red Army took revenge for the German invasion of Russia on the citizens of Berlin. The Red Army was given less than a week there before the other Allied forces came in to help occupy the city. But this was absolutely a brutal time. The order went out in the city of Berlin that all homes and businesses, all doors essentially, were to remain unlocked for a period of 3 days. And this was for raping and pillaging. It is simply what it was for. The Red Army was allowed to plunder the city. There were, in those 3 days, more than 10,000 reported rapes, which just, there's no telling how many there really were then. One of the really devastating and awful parts of the history of really all the world, but the history of this war, it's really very little understood, is the amount of violence and discord that happened in Europe in the immediate aftermath of the war. It was incredibly violent and a very terrifying and difficult time. But the Russians and the Allies were victorious. In London, here's Churchill with throngs of people outside Buckingham Palace celebrating VE Day, victory in Europe. Great celebrations ensued across primarily England and the United States and France as well. But there was also a tremendous amount of uprisings and of violence and just general discord that took place in the immediate aftermath of the war as well. In France, there was a great deal of violence, and this had to do with who collaborated and who didn't, and were you a collaborator or were you not. And so many of the French who had peacefully coexisted with the Germans or who had collaborated with the Germans, they viciously turned on each other in the immediate aftermath of the war. And regular civilians who were known to have befriended the Germans or work with the Germans experienced violence. They experienced beatings or lynchings, that we would call them in the United States. And one group that was particularly subject to group violence and to public humiliation were French women who had either married or dated German soldiers during the Nazi occupation of France. And so what they would typically do is they would find these women, mobs of people like you see here walking in the street. This is mob violence. They would find these women, they would be paraded around. You see the one woman, they've been stripped of their clothing, their dresses and tops have been ripped. They were publicly humiliated, and they were publicly humiliated by having their heads shaved. And this is so they would announce to all the world that they had befriended or they had had intimate relationships with German soldiers. And so they would shave their heads. They would very often mark their faces with the Nazi swastika in ashes or in paint of some kind as a form of public humiliation. You can see here this woman, but these were acts of mob violence, and it weren't always just for purposes of humiliation. They resulted in beatings. They resulted in killings. The end of World War II launched the greatest refugee crisis in the history of the world, even greater than the one that we are seeing today, which is often said to be the greatest since that time. The concentration camps from the Holocaust were being liberated, and there was a lot of celebration to mark the end of the war. But the spring and summer of 1945 was also an incredibly difficult and very violent time period as well. World War II very famously opened on the home front, opened a number of opportunities for women. This is a war in which all the men, all the able-bodied men between the ages of 18 and 40 were gone fighting, and so women stepped into auxiliary military positions, even being allowed to fly planes. Of course, in the Western Allies, they were not allowed into combat, but even women worked as pilots in World War II. In Russia, women were allowed into combat, of course. The Russian women were allowed into combat. They had combat pilots called the Night Witches, who were women who engaged in combat. But women served in auxiliary positions in the military. They worked in factories. They worked in shipyards. They really stepped up to fill a number of work-related roles left vacant by the men in society. There was also a tremendously successful effort in England and in the United States to get women to grow their own food and to ration the purchase of other needed materials for so that consumer goods and other products or things that would typically be used for consumer goods could be directed to the war effort. World War II was total war on a massive scale. The entire economies were turned over to the war effort, but people kept gardens in the United States and England. They called them victory gardens, so that commercial agricultural efforts could go to the war front. Food was rationed, gasoline was rationed, and people were very generally cooperative with these efforts. They saw it as their moral duty to buy war bonds and to cooperate with these efforts. One of my favorite stories here, women in England and the United States very often had to go without nylons, without their pantyhose, because nylons was used in parachutes, And paratroopers were used in large numbers in World War II. They jumped out of airplanes, and it was a great way to move soldiers around. And you didn't need parachutes in other wars. And so nylons went to the creation of parachutes. And so women would paint and color their legs with various other household materials, so they looked like they had their nylons on, even if they didn't. But this was a very broad total war, and it was a war that really enjoyed broad public support in the Allied countries, especially in England and in the United States. As had been planned at Yalta, Germany was divided into 4 zones of occupation. The Allies had agreed to occupy Germany in hopes of keeping the problems that had erupted in Germany in the aftermath of World War I from erupting again. The idea here was like, okay, we fought to surrender this time. We're going to do this right. We're going to get Germany stable. We're going to get Germany back up on their feet. So no punishment, no punitive measures like after the First World War, but they divided Germany into 4 zones of occupation, and the zones of occupation was just to kind of ensure this smooth transition and to take care of the people and the immediate problems and the immediate aftermath of the war. And so the purplish color, the lighter purplish color, was the British zone. The French, or the darker purplish color, blue, more blue. They even got a very small zone. And then the American is yellow, and the Soviet is green. Okay, the little tiny red dot to the north was Berlin, and that became a very contentious topic, I guess I would say. The Americans insisted on Berlin being divided into zones of occupation as well, and Stalin really resisted that because it was inside his zone. In July 1945, the Big Three met for the final time at the German city of Potsdam, and this is to celebrate their victory and just to kind of solidify things. Now, despite the happy faces of the 3 men here, things were already pretty darn contentious, and with large numbers of American soldiers and Russian soldiers hanging out in Germany, there was very real fear that now, with Germany out of the equation, that these 2 former allies would go to war with each other. They no longer had the common enemy to cement their friendship. And so they really were turning on each other already in a very ideological battle. The man in the middle is Harry Truman, the new American president who had been Franklin Roosevelt's vice president and had taken over when he died. Now, Roosevelt was a very gray area guy. He dealt gently with Stalin. He really kind of, he didn't push him on a lot of fronts, needing him as an ally. Truman was much more black and white, much more of an ideological purist, and dealt much more harshly with Stalin than Roosevelt did. So despite their happy faces here at Potsdam, there was a lot of bickering and arguing over exactly when Stalin was going to leave these buffer territories, when he was going to hold elections in the nations of Eastern Europe that he was currently occupying, and what he was going to do. But thankfully, this remained a war of words, and it didn't turn into shooting at this time. But the Cold War was definitely emerging in the tensions between the Americans and the Russians. Very importantly, while at Potsdam, Harry Truman received word that scientists in the United States had successfully tested the atomic bomb at Los Alamos, New Mexico. Harry Truman had no idea what they were talking about.